Hi there. Look at me on time. My name is Aja Barber, and tonight I am hosting a conversation with my friend on here and author Rachel Ricketts. We're going to be discussing Rachel's book, Do Better, Do Better. As soon as I receive the notification, I'm going to go live with Rachel. So I'm going to take the comments. I'm going to wait until Rachel sends a request. And then I'm going to take the comments off and we will turn the comments back on at the end of the discussion to do a little bit of Q&A. So just waiting for Rachel. How's everyone doing today? How's your lockdown going? I think it's becoming a bit easier because there's more daylight basically. Went for a short walk today and it was the breath of fresh air that I frankly needed. So that was quite nice, and I'm hoping that you all are well as well. So just waiting on Rachel, and then we'll start the conversation. I have two kittens, and they are proper cute, but also very big nuisance. So if you hear some scratching at the door, I might have to let them in or out because they always want to be where I'm at, even if they're not interested in what I'm doing. Let's see, there's Rachel's request. Yay! Okay, here we go. Off the comments as well right now. I accepted Rachel's request, so hopefully Rachel will appear soon. Hello.
Hello.
How are you?
I am well. How are you?
I'm good. It's really nice to virtually meet. No matter how I set my tripod, I always end up cutting off my head when it goes to the half screen.
Well, this is such a weird setup, so I've never...
Yeah, it's weird proportions. So anyways, half my head, that's all right. It's nice to virtually meet you. I mean, we've been chatting for a few years now, but it's nice to have this conversation. Thank you so much for allowing me this opportunity to interview you about your book.
Thank you.
I'm so excited for you. I have my little
tab
with you now because there's good stuff in here. I'm just really excited for you, and it's such a magical time for me to see so many Black women that I admire being published. As someone who has wanted to write my whole life and was told quietly by society that that's not for you. You don't get to do that. To be able to be here with friends and colleagues and women who look like me is so important and so valid. So thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. Thank you, Waterstones, for hosting this.
Yes, thank you, Waterstones. I'm so excited for us and our conversation, and I'm excited for when your book comes out. So we'll have to chat again.
Yeah, that would be really great. I look forward to that. So to get to the reason why we're here, we'll get into the book. I have been through this. It's one of those books where I read a lot of it out to my partner and he goes, so I need to read this when you're done. I'm like, yep, you do. He is a white person. So, the unpacking is never finished. So he's going to be reading this book as well. But, the first question I want to ask, so the book is a call to action, particularly for cis white women. And I want to hear in your own words, you wrote this book addressing a certain group, but this book is for Black and Indigenous women of color. And so I would love to hear more of your way of coming to that, basically.
Yeah. I just have this smile on my face because it's also such divine timing that we're talking today in the wake of this Meghan Markle, Prince Harry environment. Shall I say? Yeah, that face. I curse a lot, so I will have to really bring that in.
So do I.
Waterstones audience. So
I am
if you see me pausing, that's what that is. It's hard not to curse when we're talking about these responses, situations, environments of oppression. But I digress. We'll get into that. I wrote this book to white women plus, which is cis and trans women, femmes, femme passing, non-binary, gender queer, agender, gender non-conforming, folks who are similarly oppressed as women, but specifically to cis white women, but for Black, Indigenous, and women of color.
Yes.
And that was a really important nuance, and it definitely is a nuance because I didn't want to write a book to white people. Straight up, that I did not want to write a book to white people. I say that explicitly in the book because most books, the status quo is written to and for whiteness, irrespective of who the author is. That's like part of the white gaze that Toni Morrison talks about all the time. Like we write to whiteness irrespective of whether we intend to or who the author is. And so I didn't really want to play into that any further, but I very promptly realized I had to write to white folks. And for me, I had to write to white women plus, especially cis white women, because they're the ones who are causing the most harm, personally and professionally. And a lot of other Black women and femmes in this space agree. And we talk a lot about, listen, when people talk about racism and white supremacy, they often think about white men in hoods in America in the woods. And that is not,
absolutely. That's why everyone that's why so many people got up in arms about white supremacy at first. People were like, how dare you? And I'm like, just go and read and you'll see that I'm not accusing you of being a Ku Klux Klan member, you know?
No. And you can be nice and racist. Like the folks who have all of these issues with calling things racist or naming things white supremacy, you don't understand what racism or white supremacy are. Because they're systems, right?
Yeah.
Systems. So, they're nuanced and they're overt. They're explicit and they're implicit. They're intentional and they're unintentional. They're conscious and unconscious. It's like all of these things. So it was really important to me to ensure that I was calling in the folks who most needed to address this issue, who are often left out. You know, this whole thing about white fragility, which we'll also get into, I'm sure.
White really wildness, you mean?
Right? White wildness, as I've received it, really results in a particular subset of people, often cis white women, thinking that they're not involved in this issue, thinking that they are not involved in systems of harm and that they do not oppress, especially because they are also oppressed. Like we are all, as women and femmes, oppressed by, well, first of all, it doesn't matter what your gender identity is, you're oppressed by patriarchy, but you're most oppressed by patriarchy, right? If you're a woman or femme. That's absolutely true. But just because you are oppressed in some way does not mean that you're not also an oppressor. So that nuance was really important for me. And then it's for Black and women of color because it's for our healing, for our liberation, for our well-being, because we can't be liberated or free or well or healed until these systems of oppression, until systems of white supremacy are dismantled, and we don't have the power and privilege to dismantle it. Yeah, we can lead the way and guide and support, but we can't actually dismantle. So
absolutely,
that's why.
Why is it so hard for people to grasp the concept that you can be oppressed while also being an oppressor? As a able-bodied person, I can be oppressive to people who, you know, suffer from different disability. As a cisgender person, I can be oppressive to transgender women. I don't quite understand why that's such a hard thing for people to grasp. But I do think it has a lot to do with white supremacy because, you know, that whole thing about white supremacy, when you are the paradigm of what society is, and it's just, I am good. So there's no way that I can be oppressive because I consider myself a good person. I used to have a roommate that would be like, I'm a good person. I always say that any person that says that a little too excited, you should be like a little bit suspicious because like, I think everyone's poo-poo smells. You know what I mean? Like at the end of the day, all of us are capable of being, you know, oppressive to a group with less power and privilege than we have. And that's something that I feel like a lot of white cisgender women really struggle to grasp at times.
Exactly. So I call this the act of being an oppressed oppressor. I believe we all have some level of power and privilege to some degree.
Yes.
So we fall somewhere on the spectrum, and white cis women especially have a challenging time understanding oppressed oppressorship. Black cis men also have a very difficult time understanding their oppressed oppressorship. And again, that was why it was really important to ensure that I was calling in the folks who needed to be spoken to the most, I think, around this work. But again, we all have work to do. I have work to do.
I have work to do.
We all have work to do, and it's impossible to not cause harm. The intention is never, when I talk about doing better, the intention is not that we completely stop causing harm. That's just not realistic. That would be to call for perfection, and perfection is a consequence of white supremacy. It's a lie.
Yeah.
It's not real. But our intention is to address the harm that is caused, to acknowledge the harm that is caused, and to mitigate that, rectify harm we have caused, and mitigate that harm moving forward. But I firmly believe that every one of us who belongs to a dominant identity, so I'm light-skinned, talking a lot about this these days. I am light-skinned, I am a cis woman, I'm in a hetero-passing marriage, financially secure, highly educated, blah, blah, blah. A lot of privileges, and I'm a queer, multiracial Black woman.
Yeah.
So I have to have an understanding of where I fall on the spectrum, but I inherently believe that as a cis woman, as a non-disabled person, as a light-skinned person, because of the systems of harm that we all live under, I inherently am oppressive to trans folks. I inherently am oppressive to disabled folks. I inherently am oppressive to darker skinned women.
Yeah.
Whether I want to be or not. That's the fucking, sorry? That's the system. That's the system. That doesn't mean I'm evil. It means I understand my power and my privilege, and I understand that I cause harm just inherently by being part of this dominant identity that these systems of harm and oppression have given me particular amounts of power and privilege as a result, to the detriment and exclusion of people who do not belong to those groups. And so it's my work to unpack what harm I cause. Yeah. And also the harm that has been trespassed against me, and have an understanding of where I reside and what needs to happen. And I think, to answer your question from before, and then I'll be quiet, is I think people have such a hard time with this because all of that requires accountability and shadow work and trauma work. All of this is grief work and trauma work to me. It's inner deep work that needs to be done. It requires us to look in the mirror and really take stock again, like, what harm have I caused and what harms have been trespassed against me? It's the hardest work you'll ever do. Yeah. And that's why so many people want nothing to do with it.
Accountability is a tough one, especially in social media spaces, because I find it so easy for people to just go on to the next instead of, like, you know, reconciling with actions and behaviors that they've engaged in that have been, like, harmful or problematic. You know what I mean? Like, I've seen this play out as recently as a few months ago, where, like, there are situations and people really do the most and really harm people. And then when it sort of comes to light that actually this has been super harmful, no one really wants to hold their hand up and be like, oh, I did that. Everyone's just like, oh, the social media moves so quickly that you can just move on to the next thing. And I'm big on accountability because I don't feel right with myself if I know I've wronged someone. Yeah. And we all wrong people. We all, whether it's intentional, whether it's unintentional, there's still so much room to harm someone, especially when you don't understand how these systems work. And I'm the type of person where when I find out, I want to make right because I just don't sleep as well, which is selfish because you talk about the apology as well, you know? And that's something that's important is too, like, realizing why you want to apologize and really getting right with that stuff. And I need to work on that. We all have work to do. But, like, the people with the most amount of privilege and power have the most amount of work to do.
Yeah, well, they're the least likely to, they're the most entitled because that's how these systems work, because the ground, like, lifts as they walk. The ground moves to meet them. So they have the least understanding or access to accountability, which isn't an excuse. Like, that's just a reality. So there's more work for them to do around that. And also they're held to account less. That's how power and privilege works. They're just held to account less, and there's fewer consequences for them. You know, I'm really tired of people having this conversation about cancel culture and how we need to, like, move on from cancel culture, or, like,
there's more left today.
Right? The left needs to just stop being so sensitive. It's like, Erica Hart talks about this a lot. Like, what does cancel culture actually look like for people who have the most power and privilege? So in this space, predominantly white people, like, who actually gets canceled? What are the actual repercussions for these people? Because the only people I know who are actually really being canceled are Black people who are being murdered in the streets.
Exactly. A white person who even, like, loses their job because of horrific behaviors that they have engaged in on the world stage, which everyone has let them kind of get away with, will still go on to write books and do book tours and make their money and do all sorts of things.
And is losing your job being canceled, or are you just being held accountable?
Exactly. As someone who has been fired before, you know, I'm kind of like, is this really cancel culture? Does this not happen to marginalized people for lesser offense every single
For wearing
day?
the wrong hair to an interview.
For wearing
or
the
to your,
wrong
or to
hair,
the job
for
you already
taking
have.
the wrong attitude when actually somebody is doing something harmful towards you, being slowly like pushed out the door, you know, like I've definitely experienced that. And so when people even call things like cancel culture, like I joke about someone awful losing their work, but in actuality, is that person actually canceled? No, that's accountability, and it should have happened a long time ago.
Yeah, I don't have a lot of time or space for that. Again,
Yeah.
like when we make that comparison of, again, like, so maybe someone has to step down from their position, or they lose their position, or they have to come to terms with the amount of harm that has occurred, that they have caused.
Yeah.
That's not being canceled. That's being held
No.
accountable. And I want to live in a world where I am held accountable, where you are held accountable, where we're all held accountable to each other. And that's also part of this problem with what happens in social media, because this is not real. Like, this Instagram land is not real, and people who have no vested interest and absolutely nothing at stake have no problem pumping their thumbs to make statements when they have no actual information. They don't actually know the people that they're fighting for or against. They have nothing at stake. And if they were in a real conversation with either person, they wouldn't say half of the things that they feel comfortable.
Yeah, they go into
online.
the workplace and continue with the same sort of systems and harmful behaviors while posting like a happy infographic online. I literally had someone talking to me about that today. A young Black person who had a white person who they confronted about racism call the police on them. And that white person is posting the infographics, you know, and it's just like, this is why, you know, this is why there just needs to be accountability, because there is no accountability for those sorts of actions, especially if you can move into spaces and then be like, oh my God, what happened with this? It's so racist. And then people are like, oh, you're such a good person. But then you're like harming people every step that you can, you know?
I talk about this expressly in the book. Like, one of the major obstacles that I see white folks have a tough time with, and again, like, this is true of all people who hold dominant identities, who are oppressors in some way, but we're talking specifically about white supremacy. So white folks, and again, especially cis white women, have a really hard time. They get fixated on being good and right. And that is a result, we all have that, but that's a byproduct of white supremacist, ableist, capitalist, heteropatriarchy. This like need to be or be seen as good and right. Yeah. And that shows up for everyone. You don't have to be white. You don't have to be a woman or femme. That shows up for everybody in different ways, right? Depending on what your identity is. But if you are committed to being good and right, you are not committed to justice. You are not committed to racial justice or justice in any form. You are not anti-racist, because you are going to feel bad and you are going to get this wrong.
And you are going to mess up again and again.
You are going to mess up. That's part of the work. Because this work is a deconditioning. It is an unlearning of like everything you've ever known. When you really commit yourself to justice work, it's a beautiful, transformative, phenomenal thing. For me, I find my ability to connect with myself and others is, you know, paramount in a way that it absolutely wasn't previously. But also, everything that you know shifts and changes, especially if you have the most power and privilege. Those rose-colored lenses, which is part of your power and privilege that you were able to possess, fall away. And that's why I think it's so imperative that this work happens from the inside out, because if we aren't doing that work from the inside out, we don't have the capacity to withstand all of the major external changes that occur when we partake in it. And when we do this work from the inside out, then, you know, white women all the time are asking me like, what do I do? What can I do? What can I do? First of all, stop asking me what to do. There's so much information out there. Yeah. A. B, I'll continue to say, and that's the crux of this book, which like leads you through how to do this work internally so that you can get out in the world and do the external work that's required for critical collective change. But when you do start with yourself and you do this internal work, you don't need to ask me what to do, because things start to shift from the inside out. Your perspective shifts, what you understand, what you see. It's like a light switch turns on. You can't turn it back off. You can't unsee the things you start to see. And then you can't allow your friend to say that thing.
You don't
You know,
have time
that's
to
not
message
tolerant.
me and ask where to begin, because
Yeah.
you're like, every day you're just like, oh my goodness, I didn't see this before. So yeah, no, I hear you. June, I had to abandon my own inbox in June. I was just like, I can't take it. I can't take it. I can't take all of these messages. I'm here. Tell me what to do. Let's solve this system that has been built in hundreds and hundreds of years in an afternoon in your inbox.
Yeah.
Right. Oh, awesome.
Which again is all people wanting to feel good and right. Like, oh, we are now centuries late to this issue, centuries late to this issue, and we want to divest ourselves from the problem. We want to be seen as exceptional. We want to continue to believe ourselves to be good and right. And I'm not saying you have to like consider yourself to be a bad person, but you do have to have an understanding of the ways in which we are all implicated in these systems of harm. I was watching something earlier. Someone who was involved in Brexit somehow, some white woman, was talking about how offended she was at the notion that Britain is racist. Of course, we have racist people here, but to say that Britain is racist is just absurd. And I was like, that is the most absurd thing I've ever heard. There's nowhere on the planet that's not racist.
I used to hear that all the time when I moved here in 2003. So I first came here as a student when I was in university, and people would be like, oh my God, America's so racist. Like, we're just not like that because, we didn't have slavery. And I'm just like, And that was back in the day where I just was not wanting to have these conversations. So I was like, yeah, cool. Okay. Like, I'm going to go get a drink. You know what I mean? Yeah. So yeah. How do you find that is actually one of the questions for later on down the line, but like, what's the difference that you see between the conversations happening here? Because I know you've done talks in London and the conversation that's happening in Canada, US, elsewhere.
I have, I don't want to say never necessarily, but one of the most nerve-wracking experiences I've had in my work is the conversation that I led in London, because the environment is just so it's not different. I mean, it is different, but it's also like extreme. Like there's something about, so I'm a Canadian citizen born and raised in Canada. So I'm a Commonwealth country. So you want to talk about Britain not being racist. I live on lands that were literally stolen by Britain, stolen from Indigenous peoples by and for Britain. I live in British Columbia. Okay.
Yeah.
So, so I understand that nice racism, as we call it over here, because Canada is constantly like, we're not America, and so it's okay. Even on this tour, when people want to have press conversations with me in the UK, the conversation is always about the US, and I kind of refuse at this point. I'm like, y'all need to have a conversation about the UK.
Yeah,
we need to have a conversation. Like, this is what I say about Canada. We're so racist, we don't even talk about race. I don't see color, which is one of the most racist things you can say. That's just
I have heard that from so many people in the US, and like they get so mad when I tell them what they've said is wrong. That's the irony. It's just like, well, I'm a Black person. I'm telling you why what you said is problematic, and then it's like, how dare you? It's just like, oh, here we go.
If we are constantly focusing on the US, first of all, do we want the US to be the standard?
No.
Do we want like Trump and Trumpism to be the standard?
Yeah.
I don't think so. Also, like y'all had it blows my mind. But so I will say London, the UK, my experience in talking about race and racism in the UK is that you all have so much work to do because you refuse to talk about it.
The acknowledgement.
Again. The fact that people are shocked at Meghan Markle saying that the monarchy is racist when the history of the monarchy is just straight up colonialism and white supremacy.
Yeah, exactly.
There are no words for that. So,
yeah.
but it's very British in culture to just mum's the word. We don't talk about things. We just don't talk about things.
You'll stiff up the
allow
lip,
things to fester and rot at the root, but we won't discuss it. And I'm saying this as, again, I born and raised in Canada to Jamaican immigrants. So Jamaica was part of the Commonwealth until 1950. So, very much raised under the British rule and that same cultural context of like everything Irie on the island, nothing's fine. Things are not fine, but we just don't talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
We just don't talk about it. And that
Yeah.
to me is also a product of white supremacy. This like hush hush individualism, secretivism, lack of discussion, lack of clarity, lack of communication, lack of transparency, because we just don't want to be uncomfortable. We don't want to deal with the discomfort. And so I really want to call in folks in the UK, like, if you are not ready to be uncomfortable, you're not ready for this work.
Yeah.
You are not ready to be in justice. You are not for justice. If you don't have some capacity to have a hard conversation with yourself first and then with others. So I would say the big difference is stop comparing yourselves to the United States. That's not a moniker for you to be comparing yourselves to, and stop focusing all of your attention on the United States. You need to focus on all of the absolutely rampant anti-Blackness, white supremacy, and racism that exists within your own country. I saw a meme earlier that was like, imagine moving yourself to the United States to get away from racism and white supremacy, which is what Meghan Markle and Prince Harry did. So y'all need to contend with that, because that is some real.
I used to say in my talks, and I'm American, like I used to start by saying, first of all, can we like stop with this whole like, but America, I'm like, you all have an NHS, which people are trying to chip away at. And I think that's a good thing, but like, that's a low bar to clear. You should be aiming for much higher than, but America, you know what I mean? Like, I just don't even understand this idea of looking at another country and being like, whoo, when like brown and black people within your own country are telling you that those same problems exist. I don't get it. It's an avoidance though. And I think people really have to get comfortable with the idea that growth is uncomfortable. Yeah. I think that's a big thing, is that a lot of people don't grow because they don't want to be uncomfortable, but it is necessary to be uncomfortable in order to grow.
Yeah. And that two pieces to that as well. There's white supremacy affords people the expectation of comfort. Mm-hmm. So anyone who has a dominant identity or intersecting dominant identities, there's an expectation of comfort. And so we need to address that, right? Yeah. And that's why white folks have such a tough time dealing with that, or like, especially white cis women, because there's an expectation that they should be comfortable, and that, like, who are we to ever challenge that right to comfort? So we need to have a conversation about that. And then secondly is like, just because we're talking about being, I'm not even saying being comfortable with your discomfort, because you can't be, but being more comfortable, having more tolerance, doing the inner work that is required to have compassion for yourself and others to show up in this way, doesn't mean that you are suffering either. Yeah. It doesn't mean that you like have some cross on your back that you, or burden that you need to bear. Like I said, one of the main things I talk about in this book is like this act of committing ourselves to justice, committing ourselves to showing up and caring and tending for those who have been made most marginalized is collective liberation work. It's how all of us get free. White supremacy harms white people just like heteropatriarchy harms cis men. Like, all of us are being oppressed by these systems, not equally, right? But all of us are being oppressed by these systems, and none of us can be free until all of us are free. Period. And that's
you were answering my questions before I get there.
Oh.
Stop answering my questions. No, I agree with you. All of this looks like, the problem is, I think a lot of people also don't realize that these systems of oppression harm them as well. You know, like it feels like you're really like doing something, but in actuality, you are stuck in binaries that are harmful to you and harmful to the ways in which you liberate yourself. So I guess I would ask you more about spiritual activism, because I think you were kind of going there in your last point. And so maybe we go there, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. So spiritual activism for me is one of the missing pieces to all of this work. Like a lot, you know, a lot of us are going about justice work from the neck up, in a very analytical, rational, patriarchal, linear, binary way of trying to apply basically white supremacist models of knowing and understanding to to justice, which is intended to dismantle systems of white supremacy.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there's a time and place for that, don't get me wrong, but I truly believe the missing part is this heart-centered, embodied, divinely feminine, interconnected approach to justice that ensures that we understand the ways in which we are all implicated in these systems, every single one of us, and allows us to further entrench in the fact that all of us have work to do. Like I said, this book is 2 white women, but it is 4 Black and Indigenous women of color, because we have work to do too. If white folks left the planet tomorrow, white supremacy would still run rampant, because we have internalized oppression, we have internalized anti-Blackness, we've internalized anti-Indigenousness, you know, and all non-Black people, well, not even non-Black, all people on this planet are anti-Black, including Black people, because that's how white supremacy has set us up. And we're all anti-Indigenous. It's like we all have work to do, just like a room full of women or femme passing folks is full of heteropatriarchy. Like, these are systems of harm that don't require even the people who belong to that identity to be in the space in order for these systems to take place. And so how do we actually do away with these systems? For me, because we're not just talking about the last 4 years or 40 years, we're talking about 400 years. And like, the UK really needs to get together with that, because that's what we're talking about. It doesn't take long to go back in your history book to have a very real understanding of the ways in which the UK is set up as a system of racism and harm. And that's true for everywhere. Like, I lived in Sweden, and Sweden loves to claim that it is the absolutely most progressive liberal place on the planet. Absolutely not. They supplied ships and chains to the transatlantic slave trade and made bank off of the enslavement of Black people. Okay? So everyone around the world is racist, is anti-Black, has caused harm, and we've been talking about this forever. I'm not saying anything new. I don't believe that any of us are saying anything new. Maybe in a different, more nuanced way that like resonates for the time. But we've been having the same conversation for hundreds of years. So what actually needs to happen for us to change? For me, that is us actually looking in the mirror and doing the work that's required on the inside first. So before we go out into the streets, before we take up arms to make tangible, practical changes out in the world, have we done enough of our own inner work to have an understanding of our role as oppressors, what work we need to do, the harm we have caused, how we're going to continue to show up, hold ourselves accountable, and mitigate the harm we cause, understanding that even when we're out in these streets fighting for justice, we are still causing harm because it's impossible not to. How are we going to hold ourselves accountable for that? And if we haven't done that work, then the work that we do on the world, we're going to cause more harm, and we're going to be perpetuating more systems of oppression, whether we intend to or not. And I say FYI, which is bleep your intention, feel your impact. So spiritual activism to me is having a deeper rooted, heart-centered, embodied understanding of like, this work is grief work, it's trauma work, it's facing our own shadows, which is again why people don't want to do it. And to me, that is rooted in a spirituality that is secular. It's not about organized faith, although, you know, that you may belong to an organized faith and be rooted in that, and that's fine, as long as it's not oppressive, which is a whole other, I talk about that because I don't know.
That's another question.
I don't know if you can split those two, but hey. But to me, it's really just this interconnectedness. It's belonging to something bigger than ourselves. Like it's communal care. It's collaboration over competition. It's divinely feminine. It's about community care and compassion. And rooting our activism, the stuff we do like out in the world can be like conversations amidst friends or conversations we have with ourselves, or like taking it to the streets. All of that can be activism. That happens after we have taken like a long, hard look at ourselves and have a better understanding of the work we individually need to do in order for us to come together to make critical collective change. So it starts with us as individuals, and then when enough of us have done that inner work to understand that the work never ends, that it's constant, and that the work we're trying to do is dismantling systems of harm that we are all in, that we are all perpetuating. Only then, I think, can we actually start to make massive movements as a collective that can maybe start to actually shift those systems as they currently exist, which is required. We don't need little changes here and there. Total and utter overhaul. Total and utter overhaul of the systems as they currently exist.
Yeah, and there's going to be also multiple like solutions. You know what I mean? Like people get really sort of hung up, even in doing this work, to like listening to one brown or black person. That's also like white supremacy, is being like, well, you know, I see a lot of triangulation where it'll be like, well, this person says this and I'm going to listen to them instead of that person. That's just not how it works. I always remind people, you know, everybody loves to pretend like everyone would have been on the right side of history with civil rights, but there were multiple and different bodies of thinking surrounding how we were moving towards freeing ourselves during that time. There were multiple groups. There was all sorts of, you know, infighting. There were all sorts of things. I mean, obviously people talk about how civil rights was massively peaceful protest. There's a book called All This Nonviolent Stuff Will Get You Killed, which is about people getting guns during civil rights, basically, because there's this big myth, which is also built in white supremacy, of like the docile black person who will just like, you know, let you punch them in the face a few times and still hug you and love you, you know? And so I just think that people need to really sort of be open to the solutions and realize that you don't know what you don't know, and you have a lot to learn, and we all do. We all have a lot to learn. And people just seem to sort of want to like, I'm ready, I'm gonna do it, let's solve this thing. And I'm just like, oh God, calm down, you know? It's it's constant. Doing this sort of work is it's a journey, and it's not necessarily a destination, and that's what people get really, really confused with, is that something you're
and that's also why they don't want to do it, because they're like, what do you mean you can't just give me the 5 things that I do to be a non-racist and move on, you know? And I'm like, you'll never not. White people will never not be racist.
Yeah.
You'll never not be racist. It's a system. It's just part of how it rolls. It's just like, how can I understand that and cause the least amount of harm within that? I'll never not be ableist. I'm non-disabled. But how can I cause the least amount of harm, acknowledge the harms that I have caused, and ensure that I'm uplifting, supporting, prioritizing, remunerating disabled folks? That's my work. That's how I spend my power and privilege.
And I'm constantly learning too. I mean, I did a panel recently that was about like disability in fashion. I did not realize that I would be the only person who wasn't particularly, I do have a disability, but it doesn't affect how I live my life. But in the same way as someone who is, you know, really out there. And I felt like I was taking up too much space on that panel, to be honest. And I've learned a valuable lesson that next time, you know, ask, get more context, because there's someone who has a disability who's doing way more work in that spot. And that's okay. I can hold my hand up and say, next time I'm going to do better, you know? But I think that's that's the name of the book.
Because it never ends. Because it never ends. Always do better, and all of us can and need to do better. And it's not like this, you know, white supremacist heteropatriarchal finger down, like, do better. It's this internal, like, okay, let's really take a look at the ways in which I can do better. And at the same time, and this is really hard for us to understand in terms of like binaries a lot, but like, I can be calling forth folks, including myself, to do better. And I can honor just our right to be as we are as humans, because we are enough just as we are, right? So I can
white supremacy demands perfection of us as well. That's another thing. People need to really grapple with that and realize that's a part of the system, is like really being like, well, I guess I can't do the work because I did this thing wrong, you know? Right. It's like, you know?
Yeah, and like that we are complex, nuanced beings, and like, and that all of this work requires, I talk about this explicitly in the book, all of this work requires a lot of compassion for ourselves and others. And if I didn't have compassion, you know, people love to just be inflammatory and be like, well, you just must hate white women, or you hate white people. And I'm like, if I hated white people, would I have written a book to support them in helping themselves and helping everyone get free? Like, this is an absolute labor of love for everyone. No one more than Black and Indigenous women and femmes, absolutely. But this is a thesis of love for humanity. I wouldn't waste my breath. I wouldn't waste my breath if I didn't think it was possible, or if I didn't have enough care and compassion for all of us to support us in doing this work.
It's really interesting to me how fast people want to jump from discomfort to you hate people, They're
Mm-hmm.
not actually going, ooh, I'm really uncomfortable with this, and
Yeah.
I need to explore that feeling. It's just, you hate me, and that's why you've made me uncomfortable.
Yeah, and then also like you can be quick to anger as just a defense, right? So it's just like, so then I don't have to be with my discomfort. Whereas as I promote folks doing in the book, like, let's explore what that discomfort's about. Where's that discomfort coming from, and what can it tell you? Because all of our emotions are helpful, including our anger, including our righteous rage, which I really support fulsomely. If I wasn't angry about all of the atrocities happening in the world, I wouldn't have wasted my time. Like I wouldn't, I transmute my anger, my very justified anger, in support of change. And that isn't being a docile Black person. You know, people love, like you said, to like whitewash MLK. He was angry as all hell. He was very, very angry, but people like to just remember him as quite the opposite. He was murdered once he started being far more outspoken about how angry he was and like the degrees of change that were required. That's what
but we see that. We totally see that history, though, of wanting to make brown and Black people docile and more of servitude to white supremacy. We see that a lot, you know, like I was probably a teenager before I remembered that, like, before I realized that Aunt Jemima was a slave. I did not know that as a kid. I didn't know that. And then I was just like, what is going on? Or even like Uncle Ben, you know, you see this where brown and Black people are constantly portrayed in this way, which erases all sorts of historical fact to sort of make it comforting, you know, to the dominant caste. I'm reading Caste right now by Isabel Wilkerson. That is a book that every person should read, as well as yours. I don't know where we are in the questions, because honestly, we've gone all around. Let me see. What do I have here? Oh, here's a good one. There's a sense of urgency with this book, obviously. And I guess what I want to know is, how does race and all this stuff connect to the climate crisis? Because that's what I'm writing about. So I'd love to hear your take on that.
Yes. Oh, so it was really hard because there's so much that I wanted to put in here, you know, so I really had to rein myself in and really focus. So there is a little section in the final chapter around climate justice and climate change and climate crisis, and how it's absolutely directly inherently tied to racial justice, and not like in some dystopian future analysis, like in our lived reality now, live and breathe. My husband's deep into sustainability. That's why we were in Sweden. He was getting his master's in sustainability and environmental management. So I always joke that we're a hit at dinner parties between the two of us. Like, so the world's going to absolute hell.
I was wondering what the Swedish connection was. So good to, okay, now I know.
That's the connection. I also just love to live in countries that are predominantly white, so I don't know what that's about, but but the climate piece is vital because it is actually the largest issue facing us as a global collective, and always, as with any other major issue in the world, which we're seeing first and foremost with COVID-19 at the moment, always disproportionately impacts Black, Indigenous, and people of color. This is already the case. So my eyes were opened up in a really major way when I watched Years of Living Dangerously, which is a documentary series from National Geographic that I highly suggest everyone watch. It's got famous folks in it, so, you know, if you're like, I don't really know, there's like the Don Cheadles and the Jessica Albas and all that goodness, but it really drove home for me that discrepancy of experience. And one of them was Hurricane Sandy in the United States, which I have a lot of friends who live in New York. But they live in Manhattan. And, you know, that was a detrimental storm, mostly for people who lived in New Jersey, from my understanding, based on what I read and saw and knew, and like my friends' experiences. You know, they're like, they had to relocate to certain areas of Manhattan, basically, or surrounding Manhattan for a little bit, and then they got to go back to where they were, and like the power was back on pretty quickly. Like, it wasn't a massive.
My sister was there for it. My younger sister was, yeah.
And then this docuseries shows folks who live in Rochester. Sorry, in Rockefeller, in predominantly Black people. who live on the outskirts, who didn't have power or water or heat for months.
Yeah.
Months.
Yeah.
Months. No public transportation, couldn't get to work, were heating their houses with generators from their car, like just months. And FEMA was doing very little to support them. They like followed one Black woman and her child who for 6 to 9 months slept on other people's couches and in their car whilst constantly calling FEMA every day trying to get housing.
Yeah.
Atrocious. This is just one of like many examples.
I mean, Hurricane Katrina,
like
there's a debate about whether or not it was climate crisis tied. Well, as we know, the storms will get more extreme. And like, who did that affect? And the work that I do, the countries which are producing the vast majority of the stuff that we are then pushed through systems of oppression to then buy so that we can feel better about ourselves, is being made in places that are already seeing the drought, the floods. So these are people who not only are, you know, in this cycle of oppression, you know, which is pushed by consumption, but they're the ones that are seeing it first. And it's the global South.
Absolutely.
In a lot of ways, yeah.
Absolutely. One of the other stories that I really appreciated was, I don't appreciate the story, but it was enlightening, was a farm worker in Bangladesh who, like, they had so many droughts that he could no longer tend to the farm. So for him and his family's survival, had no choice but to move into the city center and start working in a factory, and then was in the factory that caught fire and burnt down. And he is now disabled as a result. Yeah. So all of these systems are tied, right? All of these things always disproportionately impact Black and Indigenous people of color in developing worlds, in exploited and extracted worlds, just as much as in, like, you know, first world nations. Yeah.
I don't even use developing, because the truth of the matter is the vast majority of the countries where most of our stuff is produced are incredibly resource and labor rich. And if we had a fair system that wasn't built on colonialism and white supremacy, these countries would be extremely wealthy. And so I generally say traditionally pillaged, which is a mouthful. But that's what I use.
Well, I've been starting to say exploited and extracted, because that's what it is.
Exploited and extracted. Like, I think even sometimes people are just like, oh, that's a mouthful, but it's worth being precise and correct when we talk about these things, because otherwise,
questioning, like, where did developing come from?
Yeah.
You know, like, what and who does that serve when we say developing?
Who does that serve, and what is being developed exactly? More extractive systems, which are going to oppress the people that live locally. That's what's being developed. What are we developing? So, I'd say traditionally pillaged, but I do like extractive as well, because that's true as well. I was recently looking at a map of all of the continent of Africa, and every single country has a resource that we in the global north has extracted. Every single one. And I always kind of
like key resources, not little things. Like, none of us would have our phone.
That. I just didn't actually look at all of it. I always knew, but I was like, let me actually just look. And sure enough, it's just all like, oh wow, so why is this country not, why isn't this continent like technically the richest continent in the world? Interesting. So yeah, no, that's that. Yeah. And I love that, you know, you do have that in the book, because I think that so much of the work that all of us do is really tied together. And I didn't ask you about intersectionality, but maybe that's a good time to talk about it.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that we can end one form of oppression without ending all forms. And when I talk about racial justice and I talk about white supremacy, to me, that is the umbrella for all forms of oppression. So when I talk about white supremacy, I'm talking about transphobia, homophobia, classism, colorism, capitalism, ableism, fatphobia, like, you name it, xenophobia, all of that to me is housed under that. And we can't, when I ride or die, right, for Black, Indigenous, and people of color, specifically Black and Indigenous women and femmes who are the most oppressed, I mean all of us. Yeah. Every single one of us. So that means, like, the fat, the poor, the elder, the dark-skinned, the non-English speaking, like, all of us, especially them, because they are the most oppressed. They live at the intersections of identities that, because of the status quo systems of oppression and harm that we all live in and all perpetuate in some way, shape, or form, are the most oppressed. And so they also need to be the ones who are paving the way. And, you know, we see this intersectionality. The other piece I want to say about the climate piece as well is like with this pandemic, the panty as I'm calling it, like everyone's focused on this COVID-19 situation, which I fully understand. Like it's something that needs to be very seriously addressed, and none
it's
of
pretty
us.
Pressing.
It's pretty pressing, and it's something that people, again, who have the most power and privilege, are finally realizing. Like, oh, insofar as like one person continues to have COVID-19, could be in the like remotest village in India, doesn't matter. So long as one person has this, the entire globe is at risk. So none of us are okay until all of us are well. And that has always been the case. And that's exactly what I'm talking about here. But to put it in a very, very tangible, practical example for people, like that's what this is. And we're all focusing on this COVID-19 pandemic, as we should. But the bigger crisis is climate crisis. That is the larger crisis. That is, and to say that they're not connected is incorrect. They're absolutely connected.
We think that these systems that are oppressing someone far away will not eventually oppress us in the same way and hurt and harm us in the same way. Yes. Let's look at, you know, microfibers, okay? For a long time, people have been saying, maybe we should be winding down off of the fabrics that come from fossil fuels. So a lot of people don't know polyester is fossil fuel. So much of the clothing that is purchased through fast fashion is polyester and fossil fuel. And the thing with microfibers is that it ends up in your water supply when you wash the garment. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, you hear the most interesting thing has been pleather for me being rebranded as vegan leather. It's plastic, okay? Yeah. And PVC factories, they're no joke. Like those chemicals are not good for humans.
Yeah.
They're not, you know, so you know, there's a lot of like, well, this thing doesn't affect me, so I'm not going to care about it. But guess who has microplastics in the water? All of us. Okay. I read a disheartening article about, you know, a placenta being found with microfibers in it. So if we don't solve these systems, it will come for all of us. And that's why all of this stuff is important. And that's why it's important to look at it from a holistic standpoint. We have, I think, are we going for an hour? I think we've got like 9 minutes left. So I was going to turn the comments back on to take some questions.
Cool. Yeah,
if that's okay with you. Yeah. I think we actually got through all the questions in a very organic manner, you know? I love that. We love to see it. So I'm going to turn on the comments and we'll see if we can take a few questions in these last 8 minutes that we have going on here. Okay. So I'm really bad at reading the questions. So we'll see if anything actually comes up. We've got a few people still left. So hopefully, they've used the question bar. Okay. So, let's see. Do we have anything? Can you repeat the title of the documentary on environmental issues and race?
Yes, it's called Years of Living Dangerously from National Geographic.
And thank you for bringing that up because it was on my to watch list. So I actually wrote it down.
I would love to know what your thoughts are on it because it was, you know, I read it. I watched it years ago and it was, mm-hmm. like a sort of, I don't want to say beginning. It wasn't, because a whole other conversation we could have is how Black, Indigenous, and people of color are like, oh, environmentalism and sustainability is like a white person issue. I don't have time.
Yeah.
And I used to be one of those people. So it was just a game changer for me in the way that it formulated everything. So I really suggest it. And then continuing to learn and unlearn.
The saddest part is that the people being affected by climate emergency currently and the people that will get hit the hardest are also the people that have the smallest carbon footprint. Now, carbon footprint is also something that was developed by the fossil fuel industry to guilt us all into thinking that it's more of our fault than theirs. So keep that in mind, but also realize that, you know, as we create harm, living our lives in the worlds that we live in with all of the privileges that we enjoy off of the backs of someone else's labor, which is also sometimes deeply unpaid, that, you know, the people that are doing this labor are not at all contributing to the crisis in the same way, and they're still getting hit the hardest, which is deeply unfair.
Yeah, absolutely.
Someone said, "This is a wonderful live. Will you save it?" Thank you both so much. Of course. Yes, this will be saved on Waterstones page under IGTV. Does anyone have a question pertaining to the book? I know I turned off the comments pretty early in, but I'm.
While you're looking, or
Mm-hmm.
while we're waiting to see if someone has a question, I did just want to share as well.
Yeah.
That when folks get to the end of this book, so through every chapter of the book, there are soul care activities and exercises. This is a book that is like a guidebook as much as it is a workbook, because I don't think we're going to read our way free. We're not going to read our way to freedom. We need to work. So this allows folks to start doing that inner work to get us to the outer work. And then at the very end, there's a link to a special secret page on my website. That's the Do Better page. And then there's a whole bunch of calls to action there, including a discussion questions guide. So you can also flip to the end if you want to get the discussion guide at the beginning to read in book clubs. And there's also a guided breathwork meditation that I lead folks through that you'll get on that link. And then there's a whole bunch of calls to action. One of them includes sustenance circles for white women, because I think it's really important that everyone has support in doing this work. This is not work that we can do alone. We have to be able to do this in community. We need to have mirrors to challenge ourselves. And one thing that I do hear a lot from white women is that, you know, they're doing this work of learning and unlearning, and they don't have people in their immediate midst who are also doing that work. And so I wanted to help create a space for folks to come together and do that work without burdening Black, Indigenous, people of color, right? So you can empower yourselves to organize and ask each other questions and hold yourselves accountable. It's not a safe space for white women, because that isn't real. But
you talk about why that's problematic in the book.
Yes, I talk about why that's problematic in the book, but it is a space for you all to get support and to support each other in continuing to do better. And then I also have a fund that we have for Black women and femmes healing, because we're putting together a collective for Black women and femmes to continue to do our work, which is unplugging from white supremacy and addressing our internalized oppression. And the fund is to support all the Black women and femmes who are putting this collective together, who are leading it, and every single Black woman and femme who is in the collective will be paid to attend, because that's part of us flipping the script on capitalism, is supporting Black women and femmes to be paid to do the work of healing. Because a lot of the work we have to do to heal is work that is required because of the oppression that we face as a result of white supremacy. So that's my little plug. So make sure you read to the end and hit the link, head to the link at the end to see your calls to action and to get more resources to support you in the work.
That's wonderful. Someone said, can you say a little more about your spiritual journey that led you to the understanding that these issues are spiritual in nature?
Ooh, sure. I always say that started before I entered the earthly realm. Like, I was raised by quite spiritual folks, but that's just kind of always been in my way of being. I believe that we're all souls having a human experience. I believe that we all chose to come to this planet at this very, very pivotal time. And that was always something that lived in my body. Like, when I was little, I used to stare in the mirror and I would completely lose my body. I would just understand that I was a soul. It used to freak me out a bit. And I remember asking my parents, like, what? Or I think I asked, who am I? I was like 8 to my mom. I was like, who am I? And she's like, what do you mean? Who are you? You're Rachel, you're my daughter. And I'm like, I know, but who am I? She was like, this little Yoda child, I don't know what to do with you. Because I was like, I'm not my body. I'm in my body, but I'm not this body. I know that. So yeah, I've always had a deeply spiritual connection that's mostly rooted in nature, like in the stars and the moon. I'm reading a lot about the moon right now, and I live in have the privilege of living in a very remote area that's really connected to nature, to animals. Like, that's, again, to me, part of the spiritual activism, is that returning to, this is also like, it's ancestral knowledge. Like, our ancestors knew this. We had no choice. We didn't have all of this technology to not be in commune with nature, to be in commune with the moon, with cycles and seasons, with other beings. So it's a returning to that knowing and that way of being, and understanding that, like, we are nature, we're part of nature, and we are the universe. Like, we're made of stars. We're made of the exact same things that stars are made of. So really leaning into to that knowledge, and just getting curious about that, you know, if that sounds totally woo-woo to you, like, just getting curious about why we've been so disconnected from ourselves, from each other, and from all beings, not just human beings, because I talk about human supremacy in the book really quickly, like all beings, plants, animals, all of it.
You know, I just love this so much. Like, I was joking and I was thinking, like, I love people that were weird little kids, but I do feel like Black children aren't, you know, allowed that. I mean, I've been an environmentalist since I was a child. My favorite color is green. I've always sort of felt a really strong pull to, you know, really think about the planet at all times. And that's some interesting writing that's coming about how marginalized people have always been on a sustainable journey in so many ways. And, you know, as a child, I felt like the movement that was environmentalism that was presented to the world did not have space for me at all, even though as a 9-year-old, I knew most of like the wildflowers and insects that were indigenous to my part of North America as a kid. You know, like I was very, very in tune to nature, but because of the ways in which these movements become so whitewashed, I felt like there's no room for me here. But in actuality, Black and Indigenous people of color have always been on a journey with this. And it's important that people just start to listen and really embrace that, because let's all just get free, you know?
Yeah. And when we are talking about prioritizing those people who have been made most marginalized, we are talking about that as a means for our collective freedom.
Yeah.
That is a means for our collective freedom, because none of us can be free until the people who have been most oppressed are free. And freedom is healing and well-being and liberation.
Yeah.
That to me is what freedom is. It is unplugging from the systems of oppression and harm that run rampant, that are global, that have us feeling so disconnected, and alone.
Yeah.
And alone, you know? And I just truly believe that another entirely new world is possible. I absolutely believe that, and you do too, or you wouldn't do the work that you do. And at the same time, as a queer Black multiracial woman, like, my ancestors been talking some game for hundreds of years, so I don't know if I will see the fruits of my labor in my lifetime. I'm not committed to that, but I'm here to do what I need to do while I am here, and I just hope more people, especially those who have the most power and privilege, will get on board with doing everything that they need to do while they are here.
Absolutely. This was such a phenomenal and holistic spiritual conversation. Thank you so much for giving me this honor of interviewing you about your very beautiful and important book. For those of you that don't know, just to remind you before we wrap up, it's Do Better by Rachel Ricketts. You can currently buy it at Waterstones and other independent booksellers. And I hope that you do buy it. It's a real journey of a book, and all of this work is the journey. Rachel, is there anything else you want to say before we tie this off?
No, just love being in conversation with you, and thank you to everyone who has been in this sacred space with us, and we just really urge you to continue learning and unlearning, as we all need to, especially during this critical collective time. And also, I hope everyone's taking really good care, because there's a lot of grief going around, just generally speaking, and it's a tough time for all of us.
Yes.
Just acknowledging that is also an important part of like doing the work we need to do to have capacity to show up and do this work. Because I
love that you talk about how that you believe that we chose to be here. I believe that too, but there's also days where I'm like, why did I pick this moment?
Oh my God, I question why all the time. Like, why did I choose to be
really pick this?
And like, can we return to sender? Can I go back to wherever I came from? This is too
Scotty,
much.
beam me up.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Thank you, everyone, for this journey. Thank you for being here. Thank you for this wonderful conversation.
And thank you, Waterstones.
I will talk to you soon. Thank you, Waterstones. Everyone,
will.
This is going to be saved. You can watch it again. It'll be in IGTV. And with that, I'm going to say good night.
Good night, y'all. Have a beautiful
Good night, everyone. Take care.